Christians and Jews have managed to get around this. When they have a violent verse in their scriptures, they say, well, yes, but it's all open to interpretation. The problem for Muslims is that still in the mainstream, in mainstream scholarship, mainstream Islam, if you say that verse in the Quran is there, I admit it's there, but it's rubbish, I'm not going to believe it, I'll throw that one out, you're declared an apostate by your fellow Muslims.
Christina.
And rightly so.
Christina, 1 second. Christina.
What I'd like to know is, where was Ibrahim when 9/11 happened? Because right after 9/11, what Islam needed were Muslim leaders who said, that is awful.
And we
that
did
is,
that. We did that.
What we got instead was lots of flashing pictures from around the globe, from around the Muslim countries, with cheering.
And there were some doctored pictures as well. There was doctored footage. But we were the first. The Muslim Council of Britain was the very first to go on air publicly, with no ifs, no buts, to condemn that violence of this nature has no place in.
Is there a problem is there a problem in the faith?
Clearly there is. I mean, firstly, clearly there is. There's a particular problem for Islamic extremism. Firstly, I don't think it's fair to say that just because it's more newsworthy to show extremism that there weren't moderate Muslims, many of them condemning what happened and continue to condemn what happens. Secondly, none of this is an excuse for the English Defence League or whatever they call themselves with their rampant racism and Islamophobia. But whatever the various scriptures say, there's a particular problem, clearly, with Islamic extremism. Christian extremism, at its worst, and it can be pretty bad, is very homophobic, and you see like the religious right. Jewish extremism is peace-breaking by building settlements and so forth. Atheist extremism, the worst that can be said for that is they want to, or seeking to ban the burqa. But Islamic extremism...
What about Mao? What about Stalin?
Yeah, well, I don't think they did it in the name of atheism. They didn't do it in the name of atheism. But with Islamic extremism, you've got several problems. It's not just terrorism. You've got the reaction to the Danish cartoons, which then called for murder. You've got, even out of the context of Iraq and Afghanistan, you had leading people, including in the Muslim Council of Britain, who I haven't heard apologise for this, burning books. You have Sharia law. I mean, just looking at women being flogged for wearing trousers. So there is a particular problem of Islamic extremism that doesn't exist today in other extremist religions.
Is that something inherent in the faith that leads to that violence?
Not at all. I think we've just seen it there, that secularists in this country don't know much about secularism. Stalin absolutely consistently focused on religious communities throughout the Socialist Republic.
Not in the name of atheism.
To say Islam is a religion of peace is as ridiculous as saying it is a religion of violence. Neither is true. It is a convoluted...
You just said it is a religion of violence.
There is violence within it, and there is some peaceful statements within it. But the question comes back again to why Muslims cannot get through the stage.
Islam is not a pacifist religion, and honest dialogue is needed to challenge apologists and confront extremists. Douglas Murray has been among those who have come forward and exposed the shadow truths on this issue. From the teachings of Islam, particularly the Quran and Hadith, some verses support peace, while others can be interpreted as supporting conflict. Extremist groups such as ISIS or Al-Qaeda manipulate religious texts to justify violence, which is far from mainstream Islam.
Does Islam encourage violence? That is our first big question. Farouk, from the Bristol Muslim Cultural Society, we hear all the time that Islam is a religion of peace. What is it in the faith that encourages some of its adherents to think that they have got a license to kill?
Nothing. It's ignorance. It's nothing to do with the faith at all. It's the fact that, the West is in Muslim countries at the moment bombing the living daylights out of innocent people, and that is inspiring these people. It's giving them a cause. It's giving them a reason to rebel.
So it's totally politics.
Much of it is to do with politics. That's where the trigger point, that's the crisis point. And if we continue to associate Islam and say Islam is a just cause here, Islam is a justifying factor, then we're way off the mark, then we're not be able to tackle the issue.
But Farouk, haven't they got plenty to go on in the scriptures? I mean, it would be kind of difficult to launch a jihad for Jesus, wouldn't it, if you looked at the New Testament? But
well, no, actually you can talk about the Christian army in Africa doing exactly the same thing.
But that was maybe politics. Can I quote this? I will...
So is this.
Yeah, okay. But haven't they got some justification when they read things in the Quran which says, I will cast terror into the hearts of those who disbelieve, therefore strike off their heads and strike off every fingertip of them. I mean, it's not love thy neighbour, is it?
No, I mean, that particular verse isn't, but that's not a general Islamic quote. That's a specific quote to a specific point in a specific time in a specific battle. Muslims were outcast, exiled, left their homes for 9 years, persecuted for 9 years, found sanctuary in a new homeland, were migrated, an exodus from Mecca, migrated. Still the enemies of Islam came to them and wanted to wipe them out. At that point, there is a point in Islam. Islam is not a pacifist religion by any stretch, I agree. But there's a point. You continue to turn the other cheek. Yes, it's a continuation of the same message that Jesus brought. Turn the other cheek up to a point. Up to a point. You cannot just stand by and watch evil spread throughout the land and do nothing about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the big differences, isn't it, between Islam and Christianity? I mean, Christ says, you know, he's asked how many times do I forgive my brother, and he says 7 times, 70 times 7, an infinite number of times. We have to address, I have to say, it's always a very difficult question. It's always a difficult question to address.
Also quote from the Bible where Jesus says, I have come not to spread peace, but I've come to bring the sword.
There is one
come to turn brother against the father.
Yes, there is one.
I want to turn this into relation about Christian and Islam.
There is indeed a verse in the New Testament that says that. The thing is that we have to address at some point, it's always very awkward to do so, we have to address the nature of the inventors of these religions. Jesus, when he invents Christianity, says all sorts of peaceable things, and on that occasion says yes, I've come to bring a sword. But Muhammad, when he invented Islam, also gave an example to Muslims. Now, we're very fortunate, of course, that most Muslims don't follow that example or are unaware of that example, but the fact is that Muhammad himself was a warrior. He beheaded prisoners. He himself was a very violent man. We can't... And many people who are Muslims, and many of my Muslim friends and colleagues and so on, realize that, you know, Islam gives you, like all religions, a guide to life. But we cannot ignore the violence of Islam's tenets, of the faith itself. When Muhammad very early on in his career... I follow the example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, myself, in a day-to-day life. I don't go around beheading people. No. I do that because the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, acted in a certain way. I give charity. I give talk to my neighbours. I reach out my hand to the elderly. I reach out my hand to the poor. I'm not saying you don't. I'm just saying that what I'm saying is that we can recognize the good things within Islam, the peaceable things in Islam. We cannot pretend that the verses that are violent and the violent doings of Muhammad did not occur because they did.
John Azuma, you're a theologian. Yeah.
Yes. I think that we have to be very honest and very real here, because to deny that there are violent verses in the Quran is really just being plain escapism.
I'm not denying
there are violent verses in any book.
There's violent verses in War and Peace.
Just one second.
In War and Peace. I mean, there's violent verses.
But that's fiction. That's not the word of God.
Well, let me finish the point. And I'm saying there are violent verses in the Quran, but I also know there are millions of Muslims who read the same verses and do not go out blowing themselves up.
Because precisely, that's the point.
Please let him finish.
Let me finish the point. I think the problem is hermeneutics, is interpretation. And different Muslims interpret this differently. You may decide to interpret it differently, but there are other Muslims who take it very seriously, and we cannot sit here and say your interpretation is right and they are wrong.
It can be seen that the debate has just begun.
And the atmosphere seems to have heated up very early. Douglas Murray challenges the notion that Islam is a peaceful religion and argues that the violence associated with Islam has more to do with politics than with the faith itself. Muhammad was a violent man, and Islam cannot condone the violence of its worshippers. Muhammad led several battles. Incidents such as the execution of tribe members highlighted the violent aspects of his leadership. Murray argues that Islam has difficulty reconciling some violent texts with contemporary values of human rights, democracy and gender equality. At the same time, he also shows how extremist groups exploit violent verses to legitimize their actions, showing the need for a stronger counter-narrative from within the Muslim community. He emphasized criticism of apologists who deny or downplay the existence of violent verses, arguing that this hinders honest dialogue and reform in religion.
We can do that. Ibrahim, we can say that that interpretation is wrong. And I totally disagree with Douglas when he says what he said about the blessed messenger Muhammad. He was a man of peace. 1 billion people or more follow his example. We are what we are because of that.
Though, didn't he?
Of course. Which leader of any community that is a growing community, that is a community under attack from time to time, will not have to resort to a military campaign? Why do we not look at the fact that the verses of the Quran which are being misused by misguided Muslims, and we don't deny that. They are Muslims, just as they are. We've had Christian people, we've had Jewish people, we've had all kinds of people who have misused their scripture to justify something. We need to shift the discussion to say,
can I ask you one thing?
What is, if I can just finish this point, Nikki, is it really the religion, or is it the people who follow those religions who have political motives, or they have criminal interests?
If this is the dictated word of God, why did he go on these tribal conflicts in the 7th century? In what way are they slay the infidels wherever you find them?
Yes.
In what way is that relevant to our society now?
If you put a full stop to some of the verses and decontextualize it and try and do a cut and paste job, you will come up with that. If I were to take a group of British soldiers all the way to Germany and we start killing the Germans, and then you ask me why I'm doing that, I say because Sir Winston Churchill said we will fight them on our shores, we'll fight them in there. You cannot decontextualize that.
Here's the problem. It's a very specific problem that Islam has uniquely among the three monotheists.
Muslims might
which
have.
is that Islam continues to find it very hard to drop. I've mentioned this in this program before. It finds it very hard to drop the violent verses because Muslims are still told by their leaders that they have to believe. The Quran itself was dictated direct to Muhammad, therefore you can't drop the verses and so on. Now, Christians and Jews have managed to get around this. When they have a violent verse in their scriptures, they say, well, yes, but it's all open to interpretation. The problem for Muslims is that still in the mainstream, in mainstream scholarship, mainstream Islam, if you say that verse in the Quran is there, I admit it's there, but it's rubbish, I'm not going to believe it, I'll throw that one out, you're declared an apostate by your fellow Muslims.
Christina.
And rightly so.
Christina, 1 second. Christina.
What I'd like to know is where was Ibrahim when 9/11 happened? Because right after 9/11, what Islam needed were Muslim leaders who said, that is awful.
And we did that. We did that.
What we got instead was lots of flashing pictures from around the globe, from around the Muslim countries, with cheering.
And there were some doctored pictures as well. There was doctored footage.
Ibrahim,
but we were the first. The Muslim Council of Britain was the very first to go on air publicly with no ifs, no buts to condemn that violence of this nature has no place in
Is there a problem in the faith?
The Imam blatantly distorted the truth when he declared that Muslims were being exiled from Mecca. In practice, Muhammad and his followers left Mecca after gaining enough power to conquer it militarily, and the pattern of violent conquest continued after Muhammad's death, as Muslim armies spread throughout the north, Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Europe.
Is there a problem in the faith?
Clearly there is. I mean, firstly, clearly there is. There's a particular problem for Islamic extremism. Firstly, I don't think it's fair to say that just because it's more newsworthy to show extremism that there weren't moderate Muslims, many of them condemning what happened and continue to condemn what happens. Secondly, none of this is an excuse for the English Defence League or whatever they call themselves with their rampant racism and Islamophobia. But whatever the various scriptures say, there's a particular problem clearly with Islamic extremism. Christian extremism at its worst, and it can be pretty bad, is very homophobic, and you see the religious right. Jewish extremism is peace-breaking by building settlements and so forth. Atheist extremism, the worst that can be said for that is they want to or seeking to ban the burqa. But Islamic extremism...
What about Mao? What about Stalin?
No, I don't think they did it in the name of atheism. What they didn't do it in the name of atheism. But with Islamic extremism, you've got several problems. It's not just terrorism. You've got the reaction to the Danish cartoons, which then called for murder. You've got, even out of the context of Iraq and Afghanistan, you had leading people, including in the Muslim Council of Britain, who I haven't heard apologise for this, burning books. You have Sharia law. I mean, just looking at women being flogged for wearing trousers. So there is a particular problem of Islamic extremism that doesn't exist today in other extremist religions.
Is that something inherent in the faith that leads to that violence?
Not at all. I think we've just seen it there, that secularists in this country don't know much about secularism. Stalin absolutely consistently focused on religious communities throughout the socialist republic.
Not in the name of atheism.
In the name of atheism, as a contradiction to the revolution. But the most important thing in this country is if we treat Muslims and other minorities like dogs, Right? As we used to say, no dogs, no Irishmen. As on Jersey they say, no Poles, no Portuguese today. And then you get some kind of reaction of alienation, marginalisation, and a reading of a text, which I read it and say...
So it's our fault?
Yeah, well, because if I read a text and it talks about me being the outcast and being treated like a dog and treating like an infidel,
but Muslims in this country are not treated like dogs. Muslims are not treated like dogs. There are no discriminatory measures in this country, and quite rightly not. Whatever you believe in your heart, whatever religion you want to believe in, I think they're ridiculous myself, but I think you can believe what you like, and no one's trying to stop you believing what you like. To pretend that Muslims are in any way sort of prejudiced against. What, for those of us who are not Muslims, what we notice is too many Muslims, as has been mentioned already, who will riot in the streets and protest about somebody when they draw a cartoon of Muhammad, but when somebody called Muhammad Atta flies a plane into a tower and kills thousands of people, they remain silent. They find the use of their prophet's image in a drawing offensive, but not somebody called up their prophet doing a violent action.
The problem with new think tanks is they have no history. In the 30s, the fascists marched the streets of England, persecuting the black community. In Southampton, the police used to raid Irish parishes, accusing them of being IRA members. There's a dark side to the British identity that we need to name and put right, because cohesion is too important to be lost in shibboleths of misjudgment.
Evan, you want to talk about today? And I want to bring John in, because my friend John here is desperate to come in. Go on, John, say your thing, and then Evan in a second.
It's very easy for us to say that the problem is with Islam, or to say that the problem is with the politicians. But I think that the truth of the matter is that there are seeds of violence in Islamic traditions, but the socio-political situations that happen around the world provide the soil, the fertile soil for these seeds to germinate.
Murray criticized the Muslim Council of Britain for avoiding or downplaying controversial issues such as gender equality, LGBTQ rights, and the application of Sharia law in the UK. He was scathing about the McBee's response to incidents of Islamic extremism, which was often inadequate or defensive, potentially undermining efforts to effectively tackle the problem of extremism. Let's put this in perspective. Muslims should not be treated like dogs, but there is a problem when some protest cartoons of Muhammad while remaining silent on acts of violence. Additionally, the darker side of British identity needs to be addressed for social cohesion. It is important to treat Muslims with the same respect and dignity as any other group, recognizing their contributions to society and their rights as individuals. While Muslims have the right to object to depictions of Muhammad that they find offensive, it is necessary to balance this with the principle of freedom of expression. Many Muslims condemn violence, but their voices are often overshadowed by the actions of some extremists. Clearer condemnation from Muslim leaders and communities could help counter this perception.
Muslims have misused the religion, and I'll be the first to condemn them. Violence, extremism has no place in Islam, has no place in anywhere in the world.
To say Islam is a religion of peace is as ridiculous as saying it is a religion of violence. Neither is true. It is a convoluted...
You just said it is a religion of violence.
There is violence within it, and there is some peaceful statements within it. But the question comes back again to why Muslims cannot get through the stage Christianity and Judaism went through and say, if it says slay the infidel wherever you find him, we don't... It's not just that we won't do it, which is why most Muslims, as you say, are entirely peaceable, because they don't follow the scriptures injunction in this place. It's that they say, not only are we not going to do that, but it would be wrong if we were to, and that verse must go. We must drop that verse.
We already have the system. We already have.
This is the reason why. This is the reason why we still do not have a mainstream school of Islam in the world that will drop the verses which permit the murder of those who leave Islam. We still are waiting for the fatwas from the mainstream schools which are going to say, if you apostatize from Islam, no, you should not be killed.
Murray argues that the violent actions of extremists are often justified using particular interpretations of Islamic texts, such as the Quran and Hadith. He believes these texts contain verses that could be interpreted as advocating violence, which extremists exploit. He points to historical instances in which violence was carried out in the name of Islam, independent of Western influence, to argue that the issue is not just about foreign policy. Murray asserts that acts of violence are choices made by individuals and groups, not an inevitable response to Western policies or discrimination. He argues that attributing violence to these factors alone simplifies the problem and excuses the perpetrators. While Murray acknowledges that Western foreign policy and discrimination may contribute to feelings of anger and resentment, he insists that these factors should not be seen as justification for violence. Murray encourages open and honest discussions about these issues to bridge gaps and promote mutual understanding. He believes that collaboration between Muslim and non-Muslim communities, scholars and leaders is essential to address the root causes of extremism and promote a peaceful and just world.